Hello, welcome to Varn blog and the New Conversation. And today I'm talking with Ed of a New Conversation, and we are talking about the legacy, um, definition, and maybe the ambiguities of anti-imperialism. Partly, this has become a more heated topic because the American empire seems to be on the downward trend as far as its ability to enforce any military, any active military program around the world. You've even seen uh, Biden start to reduce drone strikes pretty dramatically, actually, without people noticing. Partly because it's not coming out of any politically motivated place. I think it's actually just like what I would call Trajan imperial policy. The head of the empire realizes that it's not maintainable in that way anymore. Um, it's also been interesting because if you look at the DSA, which is not as much probably as relevant to your listeners and over across the pond, um, uh, the big icy pond of which separates us. The I, Actually, a lot more separates us. I'm on the west coast of the United. Well, I'm in the mountain west of the United States. So, like, there's a couple of deserts and a great prairie, and but yeah, the the DSA's popular membership opinion has shown anti-imperialism dramatically shoot up amongst the interest of its members. Um, there's a couple of interesting things about that, though, because anti-imperialism is something that means many different things. Um, and I wanted to talk to you because we were talking about a joint show for a couple months, and you were talking to me about imperialism, and I said to you, kind of controversially, offhandedly, because this is something I've said for years, that Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, or the latest stage of capitalism, depending on how you translate the Russian, was totally accurate for World War One. But actually, while its basic mechanics are applicable, isn't really a good predictor of the way empire has worked since the Second World War. Um,
Right, and I think what was it? The basically the atomic peace was
yeah,
your
yeah, which
right.
is which is something which was the argument that I said is that because of the threat of the Soviet Union, one, the threat of communist China, two, and the Great Atomic Peace, three, that something like Kautsky's ultra imperialist thesis actually is what imperialism kind of looks like post 1950. Um, Now, if you are a periphery country, and I'm gonna warn our listeners, I'm gonna use a lot of world systems analysis in this, even though I have issues with world systems analysis, but um, that's no consolation to you because you're still where the capitalist powers and even China are going to have to play and have proxy wars, etc. But if you're
That's sorry,
mhm,
go on.
go ahead. But if you're
I
in the
was just
developed world, it's very different.
yeah. I was going to say the that's what's been playing on my mind since you mentioned this. The I never got around to getting to ultra imperialism, but just from reading Lenin's critique of it in that chapter, it seems that the atomic sort of guarantee it just sort of expands the scale of the peace, the allegiance,
Mm,
and that within that sort of radically different context to 100 years ago, you've got the imperial powers. Well, first of all, obviously they have sort of developed and emerged, China and Russia, through the last century, but how they how they're operating, there's there still does seem to be like a tendency to operate with the same logic, that they're still sort of mobilizing in pockets where they can in order to sort of advance that imperial mechanism outlined by Lenin. It's just that box this context is sort of overhanging it and sort of impeding it. And from, I mean, to sort of employ Lenin's argument to it, that at some stage a balance of power that countenances nuclear power may occur that then all of a sudden lodges things into the continued mechanism.
Yeah,
And the question is, how do you see like like the skirmishes, the proxy wars, the sort of Ukraine, the South China Sea, these sort of things? That's what puzzles me with that context, with that piece, and like what are the extent of possibilities as you see them?
Well, to get to why I feel that way, and to apply it to these areas, I think we need to backtrack a little bit and talk about the economic logic of Lenin's imperialism, because that's often completely missed. What Lenin, the brilliance of that piece that people, don't totally look at. One, Lenin picks up the liberal Hobson and really uses him, but Hobson, yeah, I think so, or Hodgson.
Hobson.
Hobson. Okay, that's right. It's right the first time. I'm always like, all these British names sound alike to me. No, but the other thing is the synthesis of the focus of the declining rate of profits as a tendency, not as an absolute law, being synthesized with Hilferding's work on finance and monopoly capital, which is first really picked up on by Bukharin and didn't really, Lenin's gift is often just making something very complicated seem very simple in a pamphlet. But because it's so simple, people miss that there's an economic logic for this, for the notions here of super profits and this, that, and the other. This brings us, though, to things like the areas of proxy conflict and contestation. In a world system analysis, you can come up with some weird ideas like that because of exports to import ratios, that countries that have super high GDPs are somehow semi-periphery. Now, I honestly, personally think that has to do with Wallerstein and Co.'s earlier 90s and before commitment to a kind of soft Maoism than it does to objective material analysis. Because if you take that strategy consistently, you have to describe, I don't know, parts of the EU as semi-periphery countries. Like, it would apply to Germany, for example. And I have heard people trying to make that argument. So the flows of capital can't be what's defining this here.
Mm-hmm.
So what's going on? Well, regardless of whether or not you think China is still a capitalist power, or if it ever was a capitalist power in its modern incarnation, which is a debate I don't really want to get into today, it exists in the larger capitalist system, and there's no way around that, regardless to how it functions internally. It functions as a capitalist internationally. So what we see now, and I think this should concern us because we don't really know what this means, is because of the end of the Soviet Union, the ideological threat to the United States that was prompting a whole lot of the I'll call it the transatlantic superpolity, like Europe and Canada, maybe all of Japan in some ways, definitely with the United States at the helm, beginning to back off. And what you see is a return to something like 19th century style great game politics, and the carving out of spheres of influence, partly for market game, partly for the fact that all of these societies have seen declining GDPs in the last decade. Now, China's has declined. Well, China's has actually declined the quickest, but it had the most to fall.
The most, of course, yeah.
Right. So, and it's still doing way, way better than everybody else. Like, like, when's the last time anyone in the West saw 6% GDP? Like, it's pretty intense. But because of that, these spheres of influence are going to have to be shored up. And so you see like the Belt and Road Initiative, the many attempts, even during the BRICS days, to set up like a counter currency to the US as reserve currency, etc. Most of these haven't stuck before COVID, so you have an external shock now. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now that it is pretty clear that U.S. hegemony is not going away, but it's nowhere near as powerful as it was even 10 years ago. So what does that mean as far as like these conflicts? It does mean that you could see a return to the conditions Lenin was talking about. You really could. The question is, does the bourgeoisie want to destroy the world? Like, and I actually don't know that that's a closed question.
This is the that's the sort of question that we sort of happened across at the very start of this channel about 2 years ago. It was we'd done like a 6-part series was our kickoff, and there was a lot of Lack Lao move, but we wrapped it up by looking at Meekson's Wood, Origins of Capital, and David Harvey's sort of he wrote in a couple of places this obscure sort of footnote in, I think, chapter 15 of Capital, where Marx is talking about industry changes because industry changes, and developed his theory of co-revolutionary change. And through discussing those two, well, the book and the concept, it just sort of occurred just naturally as we were talking, like, is this capitalism anymore? What basically the question that sort of arose out of it was like, what's the actual power at play? So you've got the economic incentive, you got the subjectivity coming out of rural England pushing the capitalist system globally, but you know, the aristocracy only lost their heads in France. The idea of sort of like a power block and conservative hierarchies still continue through the capitalist process, and as like Lenin's describing, imperialism is capitalism in decay. So where does that leave us in terms of power and in terms of what people are doing? You know, to your point about like, do the imperial powers want to continue existence or not? Like, are they? If you marry the two principles, you've got like they in their at the head of their empire, their corporation, whatever, have an existential logic that they're continually trying to ward off competition from others, just like the very, very same situation that the early capitalist farmers would have found themselves in. But then you've also got the radically different level of power that they find themselves in the imperial stage. And yeah, how they face a dilemma, whether they realize it or not, in whether or not they want to sort of continue existence as a whole rather than personal.
It's interesting. The reason why when we talked about this, I told you to read John Smith's Imperialism, because one of the things that Smith is really good on that I think most people miss. So I remember, you know, when I was coming out of my reactionary period about 15 years ago, I started reading, you know, Maoist third worldist versus like Trotskyist, you know, and I found neither one of them convincing, actually, honestly, because the idea that labor aristocracy, even though it's a real thing, like, was totally nation based, seemed to be true only in the Keynesian period of like the 50s and 60s, and even then it was not even within any national polity. So different industries or whatever benefited differently, different regions. The south of the United States was kind of a periphery within the United States itself. You can think of Ireland and Scotland in Northern Ireland and Scotland later in the UK, etc., and so forth. Wales to some degree. And then there were some other ambiguities that I started noticing that Smith, indirectly pointed out to me. So, on one hand, the imperialism is about the expansion of markets and the dumping of overproduction, but that's not totally clear in practice, because if you were just expanding markets, underdeveloping those places, which is an objective fact, and limiting their development by international law, and like it's in the fine points of labor triage and free trade agreements. It's in IP cartelling. It's in the use of cartels to maintain various resources, and also conversely counter cartelling, like OPEC, for example, to sort of tamp down on those powers. Although it's funny to think of OPEC as an anti-imperialist force ultimately, right? Like it doesn't end up being that for very long. But so you see like this divided and unevenness in a kind of abstract way becomes really hard to get your mind around, because on one hand, super profits are dependent on dumping all this overproduction somewhere. Now, if you really look at what the United States did, it came up with a kind of accidentally brilliant way to handle it through the Keynesian International. And Paul Maddock writes about this in the 1950s, that the largesse expanded to Europe meant that they could dump overproduction there without really upsetting Europe and even seemingly benefiting them, because so much was destroyed in World War II.
Yeah, exactly.
But then instead of expanding that to Latin America, which some of the Keynesians wanted to do, actually, the business community, according to Maddock, was getting tired of paying for it. So maintaining the kind of prior relationship of pure extraction that the United States has had with Latin America under the Monroe Doctrine, going all the way back to its instantiation, basically, was maintained in Latin America. So you could do both things, but in different areas. So you could dump your overproduction towards Europe, and you could extract in Latin America. Now, this meant that Africa was still kind of up for grabs. So in some ways, the scramble for Africa never truly ended, particularly when the British started pulling out and the French started, although the French really, like, the fact that they can extract debt payments for colonialism in Africa tells me how much they pulled out. But when you started seeing that, things became a lot more up for grabs. So you saw the United States even encourage national liberation movements in Africa, to some degree, because they knew that these nations that would be formed, even if they were socialist, would have to play between the USSR and the United States for survival. And that meant that the U.S. influence, even if it was competing with the USSR in the region, would be maintained.
Also, in this period is, I don't know how strong a factor it is. I've always sort of assumed that it was, but maybe you know the detail. But how much is private funds still sunk into national bonds for the war effort? As in how sort of underleveraged? How much power, how much sort of flexibility does sort of the existing power before the wars have? And how much in this period are they told to sit on their fingers, while obviously the sort of the core labor market is powerful because it was decimated. Its value goes up compared to the sort of scarcity of capital. This is my assumption. You can tear it apart, tear it to shreds.
I'm looking at the bond markets and bond returns. So.
But where I was going to go with it, before you inform the assumption, was that the sort of the encouragement of like the structural state delivered efforts, first of all, like you just mentioned, abroad in the colonies or would-be colonies, but also at home with the Marshall Plan in Europe, as you mentioned, and of course the factors of that sort of inspired Keynesianism, like the sort of the poor state of soldiers, effectively, and the fallout of the Great Depression. All these factors coming to generate a situation where this sort of the structuralism played out. And my understanding, and I don't have a great basis for it, but my understanding of it was that for this period, that structuralism was permitted to sort of build up these structures, the consumer class in the central core, and then the nation state building in the periphery, was sort of a place to deposit wealth without having direct access to it, up until a point where Reagan and Thatcher start putting in both internal and foreign policies to start reaping the sort of benefits on both sort of prongs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. So interesting to look at this, and just this is just from a book called The Triumph of the Optimist, which is funny, which is about bond market returns. And bond market returns after 1950 in Germany, France, Italy, Japan, and Belgium were above 3% on investment, which means that they outstripped inflation. But prior to and this is interesting, prior to 1950, all of them were net bond losers. The U.S. has been kind of steady both from 1950 to 2000, with a bond return rate of a little under 2%, which is about, basically it's the same as inflation. Not anymore, but was during that period. The UK, interestingly, had very low returns on bonds in the first part of the 20th century, but normalized to US, almost exactly to US returns afterwards. So what does that look like to me? It looks like what you see is the government sector being somewhat steady state in the two imperial cores for about 100 years, but that you saw a bigger dip at the end of empire in the UK. I suspect we'll see something similar in bond markets in the US now. Now, to answer your question about how this gives you backdoor access to capital, I think when you look at, you know, what you're doing, even with like these areas that were protected under trade regimes, you know, the whole protectionist developmentalism thesis often picked up in Latin America, and you know, and is what the UK and the US actually did. It does seem like that it was a way to expand, to like basically move wealth and value from these developing nations into the core in the middle of the 20th century. But a limit was hit to that, probably with the profitability crisis in the 70s. So, you know, the natural exhaustion of that Keynesian polity, particularly in the US and UK, happened. Now, I know there's a lot of people on the liberal left in the United States. I don't know. I know there's some of these people in the UK too, but I don't know how much influence they have, like the modern monetary theorists, who would say that the 70s was a policy decision, not. And David Harvey, by the way, does not explicitly endorse his point of view, but his description of neoliberalism tacitly endorses this point of view, that even the profitability crisis was a policy decision, that allowance for stagflation to go on a little longer would have meant that the part of stagflation would have ended eventually, once the shock of the oil shock of the 70s corrected itself. That's their narrative.
Yeah.
I think this is horseshit, but because I the reason why is in both the US and the UK, the beginnings of neoliberalism do not start under Reagan and Thatcher. They
Exactly.
start under Carter in the US, and well, even a little bit under Gerald Ford. And they start in the UK under the end of the that Labour administration trying to suppress wages to stop inflation.
I don't suppose there's any sort of incentive by people on the verge of starting to climb the ladder at that point to allow once that correction is made, for the benefits of that to sort of imbue itself through the entire economy in a sort of extensive distribution, the same way as the effects of the post-war sort of economy, the Keynesianism and Marshall Plan had the effect in the 50s. Like, there's no incentive for that, and that I would have thought is like just imperialism.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably fair. I mean, one thing I would say is I tend to be a Marxist in my analysis, not a Maoist, which is not to say Maoists are not Marxist, but they do invert the order of the imperialist capitalist paradigm. So, depending on how you understand the primary and secondary contradictions in Mao, and I don't think Mao actually took the most extreme form of this, but the inversion of imperialism being the most immediate threat versus capitalism being the most immediate threat does have some logic here. And I guess the question now is, well, we'd have to define capitalism in a clear enough way to see what was going on right now. And one of the things that you see in this current battle, and this is where the labor arbitrage part of Smith's argument is so interesting. It actually, Smith considers himself a Marxist, but I know a couple of my friends who gave up on Marxism after reading that book. But is that there does seem to have been an acknowledgement of the need to curtail the benefits of labor in these periphery countries by pure labor arbitrage, and like enforcing austerity is the obvious, but there's a bunch of things and tied into it. Limitations on developmental technologies, this and the limiting places' ability to develop their own technology by making them use technology from the developed world and to accept that trade as part of their development. That's all there, which indicates that even in neoliberalism, that, and this kind of goes against the idea that neoliberalism was just like free markets everywhere. That there was not faith that the market would insulate the core from periphery developments, and that legal, and by legal we mean force, really, by gunboat diplomacy implied, because that's really what the law really is ultimately. And by locking people into buying certain things, you think about like the end of the Camp David Accords. What does Egypt have to do? Well, Egypt gets almost as much money from the United States as Israel, but unlike Israel, has to use that money on what? To buy U.S. arms. Like, it's literally like we give a bunch of developmental aid to Egypt. We still do. And you know what they do? They buy all of our used military surplus, which does a couple of things. It locks them into our technological development pattern. And, particularly in the 20th century, there was actually a difference between Western capitalist technology in some ways and USSR technology. And so locking them into our chain meant that even for their military, that gotten military gains locally, that they couldn't turn as much to the Soviet Union, which was something that the U.S. wanted to cinch down on in like North Africa, because people like Nasser and the Pan-Arabists have been able to play the U.S. and the USSR off of each other. I mean, if you know the history of like the building of the massive dam in Aswan, like the U.S. is brought in at one point, then the USSR is brought in, then NASA brings the U.S. back. Like it's like this, like they're just trying to. He's using them to get this additional engineering help and to like basically get credit. And there was a lot of people in particularly the Middle East, because they were raw asset rich, who did this pretty well. I mean, the Shah of Iran did this to some degree. And so I think it is no accident, actually, that those systems start to decay, like all these client states start to decay, some towards the left, but honestly, a lot of them towards religio-nationalist right in the Middle East. In the late 1980s, because this whole system and that instantiation of capital, like that ability for capital to rebound itself from a crisis, ended. So the reason why I think this is interesting and ambiguous, right, is that we've all kind of thought that capitalism was in decay, and Marxists have historically, whether they were a miserationist or Grossman breakdown theorist, which I think has some value, but they keep on predicting that this stage of capitalism and decay will be a final crisis.
Yeah.
And what I think looking at Kautsky's ultra imperialism indicates is and the weird and radical idea that somehow both Lenin and Kautsky were right, but at different times. That Lenin was way more on the pulse of what was going on in the early 20th century, but that Kautsky's prediction ultimately would hold through for the middle of the 20th century is something that should at least encourage us to have maybe like epistemic humility or some stupid shit like that when talking about the period of capital we're in. I mean, one of the things that I think right now that like the left is talking a lot about neoliberalism for the past 10 years finally, right? But let's be honest, neoliberalism as a project has been ending for the entire time the left has really been talking about it to the general public.
Yep.
Right? It's like, oh, so we're fighting the last war again. And so another example of that, this is when I was at Zero Books, I really pushed for the publication of Continuity and Rupture, which talks about Maoist third worldism and Marx and Leninist Maoism developing in 1984. One of the reasons, and I thought that was a brilliant thesis, but one of the reasons why I wanted it published was because to point out that like the conditions they were describing were already over by the time they saw it and made a political position about it.
Yeah.
So like in the 1980s, well, the idea of the entire West as labor aristocracy is already really ending. Like, even though you still have massive extraction chains going from the developing world to the developed world, from the periphery to the core. In terms of like raw materials, that even using the developing world for like markets was not so much the point anymore. Or it was selective. Like we could bring markets to China and to the former USSR, but we're not really caring if we bring them to Africa or not.
Well, that's it. I think the they might not be super profits. Excuse me, but the extraction of profits whatsoever. This sort of comes back to the sort of the power. The power axis on the matrix between the logic of capitalism and what people are actually sort of attempting to do in their isolated moments. Where was I going with that? No, I've dropped that ball there. Sorry. Go for it.
No. I think that's an interesting, like, I think one of the things that we have to always do is, instead of like I've been struggling right now to figure out how rentier relations, which are increasing throughout the developed world, and actually even the developed the quote unquote developing world, right?
Mm-hmm.
Really play into this, because I keep on, like, if you look throughout the entire history of the 20th century, socialists and even capitalists are often predicting the end of capitalism around the corner. Because of the ends of super profits, one, because of the declining rate of profits and immiseration, two, because it really doesn't make sense that capitalism even survived the long depression in the 1880s, three, so you see these trends, and you see the political structures around capital change.
Yeah.
But they often, it is never obvious at the time. Like, even though, for example, I do work on Christopher Lasch, and I was studying Christopher Lasch, and he comes on to talking about neoliberalism the way we mean it in the late 1970s, early 1980s. So he is aware of it as it's coming out, but most of what people miss about him when they quote him in context to now is even the first time he used the term neoliberal, and in a book, I believe, written in 1968, it's in a book called The World of Nations, he wasn't referring to neoliberalism as we mean it. He was actually referring to the synthesis of Fordism and state bureaucracy revitalizing an old and sclerotic bourgeoisie in America that was like, which was like even kind of an aristocratic class that had established itself as the first
which isn't
here.
Insanely divorced from the sort of the aims of the
the actual neoliberals, yeah. Right. Right, but it's interesting because people misunderstand him because they think he's fighting our battle, the battle that we had in the last 20 years. Because it's clear that what he's describing is both a rupture from and continuous into neoliberalism, in the way that, like, the way liberals talk about Keynesianism versus neoliberalism now, as if they were two completely separate beasts, and like somehow Reagan flipped the switch in 1981, or Thatcher in 1978, and we ended
demarcation.
Yeah, a clear demarcation. The actual, actually, like with the birth of capitalism itself, there's actually like 100 years where you're like, is this capital?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. I mean, even in the case of Britain, first truly capitalist country on earth is also the country that never got rid of its aristocracy, really. I mean, what is it that the UK still, your richest person is like a noble tax farmer?
All the land is still noble owned. Yeah.
So you never even had like bourgeois land reform, and yet you're also the first. You're not from the UK. Sorry.
No. My face wasn't that.
But the United Kingdom in general both has the most advanced and also the most elements of feudal society left because it was first. And again, that's misleading. That can cause a lot of people to misunderstand what's going on. So what we're seeing right now, in my mind, is imperialism is still a big damn deal, but it's changing again, right? Like, the United States can no longer unilaterally, and you see this from the tenor of the IMF, the tenor of the WHO, I mean, the World Health Organization, the tenor of the UN, is the US is still the biggest dog in town, but it's a much weaker big dog. It's a much older big dog, and it's a much more, frankly, internally incoherent big dog than it was even during the Bush years, which was already showing signs of fracture. I mean, basically, the moment the USSR went away, the US starts to show signs of fracture. Which is fascinating, right? Yeah. Like, because but again, no one saw that in the 1990s. You're not reading books predicting the imminent fall of the United States from anyone serious in like 1995. You
Yeah,
are
it's
getting
the
it,
superpower. That's the
right?
narrative.
But you are getting it by like 2006, right? And what I think people miss, I guess my just the concession that I'm going to turn it over to you is like, if you look at Europe as the world superpower, right? Europe didn't feel that collapse all at once. Even with the calamity and catastrophe of the Great Wars, it didn't feel it all at once, right? Like it was in the late 20th century. Yeah, things got shittier, and then they got better. But then you looked up and like, oh, everyone hates America now because really they stole our spot, and we're bitter about that. Like, you know, it's one of those things. Is I understand everybody's anti-Americanism, but Europe's, and I'm just like, you're just mad. Like,
That's a fair point.
Like, you're just mad that you didn't keep it. Like, come on, be honest. But I mean, we're gauche and nasty and whatever. But what we really do is we show you the ugly side of yourself. But I think now what is interesting right now is China's clearly the the best posited for this transition to whatever's next. But it's actually not in as good of a situation as the US was in the beginning of the 20th century. Partly because the war situation and the imperial situation have totally changed. And partly because like certain kinds of imperialism are both ideologically and also just actually not going to be possible for China. So if China wanted to become an imperialist power in a direct military expansionist way and not kind of an indirect soft influence way, it's not going to have the recourse that the US did, because the level of destruction required to reset conditions after that say happened after World War II would probably destroy the planet.
Yeah.
So that's not going to be a path for them, even if they wanted it. And I don't know that they do. Like, I'm not one of these people who, like, I'm not going to give China the out of saying, oh, they're not imperialist at all. But I don't think they're trying to be the next United States, nor are they, even though they're going to be the economically dominant power probably in the next 5 years.
I think they're concentrated on reconciling themselves, whatever sort of ideological tag they want to attribute to that. It's like, you know, amassing the control of natural resources, and that focus on immense growth is just to provide itself credit in the future for any internal reorientation that it needs to take.
Right.
Whether that's for communism or whatever.
I mean, we are seeing the Red New Deal, which is basically, as I told someone the other day when I was being an asshole, the Red New Deal is kind of great, but it's like the promise of social democracy delivered by communists with a couple of social conservative values thrown in just for fun. Like, it's not bad. It's not a bad thing, and it does indicate that China itself is moving out of its like heroic capitalist phase, basically, which I know a lot of people would not apply to China, but I think from 1980 to at least Xi Jinping, you can definitely see Xi Jinping, I'll get my Chinese names blurred, but the billionaire who was the head of the CPP for a while before Hu Jintao, that period was a period of like heroic capital accumulation in China, and it did turn the country from a largely agrarian nation, which it still was up until the late 1970s, into a hyper modern capitalist country in a dramatically short period of time, and without the kind of purges or death toll of the USSR's development of similar capacities in the early 20th century. So basically, I sometimes say, well, you have to kind of think that even like calling China a state capitalist is not necessarily even an insult if what its goal was the NEP on crack, like to develop capacities. The question is now, though, China wants to, and China can control individual capitalists or whatever, but what it can't do still is spook foreign investors totally. Like they still, so no matter what you think it is or what it want to be, it is not free from the reins of international capital. It's just, that's absolutely clear, which means that its policy is going to have to like walk that line. And I think you see that in Xi Jinping's policy, in that you see sometimes kind of expansionist claiming of historical territories, but then dying it back down, so as to both provoke the United States but not provoke the United States, because an idea of direct war, but really the core of both those countries does not want that, no matter how bellicose they talk to their own publics. And that becomes immediately clear as soon as one side wants to call the other side's bluff on, say, Taiwan. And yes, I think we can all see that eventually, that Taiwan will be reabsorbed into China.
I mean, surely they're just waiting for it to not be in the news anymore. And
right. And I think what they're waiting for, honestly, is to cut a deal with the KMT. Because there are elements within the KMT, and this is because I know Taiwanese internal politics a little bit. But weirdly, the left opposition in Taiwan is actually the more hostile party to China. But the KMT has made, there are elements within the KMT who has made some forays into being able to broker a deal with the mainland, but the majority of the KMT can't do that because of just the historical position of the KMT in relation to that. So when you look at Taiwanese politics, which Taiwanese internal politics, which oddly enough people in the West just don't really do, there probably is over time a window where something like the Hong Kong agreement could happen, and then basically like with Hong Kong, there'd be, after a few years and everybody dies down, it gets normalized, and the central government would assert power directly. Unfortunately, like with many areas, like Tibet is another one, international pressure makes letting the area stay kind of a culturally autonomous zone within China, like say Xinjiang, or like the Chinese Korea, which people often don't know exist, and areas like that are like the Manchu zones, not possible because it looks like a concession to outsiders in a way that would be internally damaging, which probably could have happened in another situation. So I mean, all this is quite bad. I mean, like, when I say it's quite bad, I mean, like, there's a sense in which right now the US doesn't know what it should do in regards to China. It clearly does not actually want direct conflict with China, but it does want to curtail its growth. It has no real means of doing so. Its primary means of trying to assert pressure is basically trying to pull Europe back into the US trade zone, but there's very little incentive for that to happen.
Very little to trade with.
Yeah, exactly. But although what's interesting about this, if we're completely honest, looking at raw trades is misleading, because the US, the Eurozone, and China are still the three most manufacturally productive economies on Earth. What's the reason why people in the US don't think they're manufacturing productive is because they don't know people who work in it, because it's like 9% of the population, because it's been hyper automated. But this is also happening in China. So, ironically, a lot of the reshoring that's happening in the US is actually from Chinese automation. And it's like, well, now that everyth's automated, we might as well just push it back to the United States, because it's going to be made by robots either way, and it's fixed capital.
You don't think they'd be able to shut up shop in terms of FDI inwards if they wanted to?
What do you mean?
China?
Shut up shop in what sense?
Oh, That's something that you said about a few minutes ago about like deterring FDI.
Oh,
have I snapped your
you
train
said,
of
yeah,
thought there? Sorry.
you did. Um, oh yeah, foreign direct investment. Um, do I think they could do that? I don't think they want to do that because
If they wanted to, because I was
it,
sort of under the impression that there eventually would be a point where an internal reorientation of the economy would include that, but it's just a hunch.
well, here's the question: do you think China's a capitalist economy or not?
I don't think it matters.
Oh, you don't think it matters?
Uh,
Um, I think if it's a capitalist economy, shutting off FDI is impossible.
yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah, I guess that's what I mean by reorientation.
If it could do that, it would have to. So I guess what we have to ask ourselves is, do we think China can, in one country, now admittedly a massive multinational, and I mean national in the old European sense, not in the modern sense, multinational polity like China, could it shut itself off from FDI only if it had already incorporated a lot of external countries into a trade network that believed in it enough to risk their own access to other markets. So, or that they'd have revolutionary global communism. So those are your two ways that could happen.
Yeah.
I can imagine that happening. Like if the Belt and Road Initiative really totally integrated Europe and China into like basically a singular economy, then theoretically it could shut off FDI because it would already have most everything internally anyway.
Yeah.
But I also think if it does that, there's no way for it not to look like an imperialist project to places like Africa. And I think you see that
they're benefiting.
right. I think you've seen that actually in the tensions around China and Africa, because there's both a sense that China is a much better partner to deal with than the United States or Europe. But there also a sense there is a lot of resentment in Africa, and I know because I live there, about China's influence into their own politics and distrust that it's going to stay beneficial to Africans. Because the other thing that we have to like not factor out is that has China subdued the nationalism within its own public enough to become something beyond China without it becoming like national imperialist, and that's a question that right now I'd say the answer would be no, but like what, because it's needed its own sense of nationalism to combat Western influence.
Yeah.
So, but there is a point where that's a problem, you know. And I think, for example, the nation building that's going on in Xinjiang with like the Uyghur and the Muslim populations in the West, I, I think that the left has been blindsided about how to handle it, because on one hand, it does meet the incredibly silly and basic definition of genocide given by the UN of cultural genocide, which is kind of a laughable category, actually, if I'm completely honest. Because I can't think of a national project that isn't based on cultural genocide. Yeah. Does it actually kill does it actually wipe out the people involved? Usually not. Actually, but that's not what the term is aimed for, and it seemed like an overly broad expansion of the idea to cover certain things after World War II. But to also say that there's nothing ugly going on in Western China, I think is also not true. Like, the stats back up that there looks like there's at least been a massive decline in birth rates. That cannot be solely explained, and these are China's own official stats. Like I'm not pulling from Western stats for this. So what does it look like? Well, it looks like a kind of milder version of what you saw in the consolidation of the U.S. With indigenous peoples, without the period of genocide that happened in the earlier phase of settler colonialism, but in the consolidation of the national identity later on, in the early 20th century, it does look a lot like that. And it's probably significantly less brutal, which is normally the China's argument about this is tu quoque, right? Like, well, you did it too, and you did it much worse.
Yeah.
So you can't call us out on this. And fair enough, right? I guess they're like, duh. But at the same time, what does that mean for imperialism, and what does that mean for capitalism? Well, I'm not one who thinks we can just rest our laurels on the CPC just handing the world communism on a platter.
Yeah.
But I also think pretending that what China is doing is the same thing as what the US did in the early 20th century is just not true. Even though, like, I do think there are imperialist imperatives in China's economy, in so much that it still has a whole lot of elements of capital. It has more elements of capitalism than the Soviet Union did.
Yeah.
So
I mean, there's a shout that, like, if you're in the imperialist stage of capitalism, that the only way you survive is to mimic this.
Right.
And that's what they're all doing anyway, except that obviously the goals of an outright capitalist imperialist will maybe entirely different. There's existential to the existential logic to sort of grow and expand, but there's also, I mean, the USSR was unable to withstand the barrage historically. Right. So
I think you're completely I think you're right, and I think that tension is something we're going to have to deal with. So to get back to the ambiguities of imperialism, I think the left has had a hard time understanding imperialist prerogatives being not just about good and bad states. That in this system right now, there's almost no way for a state actor to not engage in imperialism in some way, because it has become fundamental to maintaining capitalist markets.
Yeah.
The question in regards to China is not something that you and I can answer, because what it's really based on is which faction and side of the Communist Party will ultimately win out. And right now, it seems like I know a lot of neo-Maoists in the West have picked up to Xi, because neo-Maoists in China have become more and more copacetic with Xi, despite their initial fear and opposition to him because of his liquidation of Bo Xilai and way back in the last decade, which is something everybody's forgot about. But I think there, we don't know how it's going to settle out. What I can tell you is when I meet Chinese people, most of them are not dyed in the wool communist, but they're also not socialistic. Like, it's just like, it's,
yeah, I think that's that sort of is a direct link to what you said earlier about, like, whatever's coming next, China seems to be the thing. So they're not thinking necessarily in the dyadic terms that we're thinking capitalist communist. They're like, oh, we're just trying to survive. We're just
right. Like, it's like people in America don't think about themselves as imperialists most of the time, and in fact, one of the greatest gifts to you
I was going to say, but there is a large cohort that attach themselves very vehemently to capitalism, and the same over here. Like, there is a, like, capitalism.
Oh yeah,
is a thing.
There's a lot. But what's interesting in the United States is I don't think you have in the UK is the anti-imperialist capitalist right, which we do have, and we've had kind of the entire time. Although it's
Labor is.
Well, yeah, but what's interesting about the United States is our social democratic tendencies are not in an anti-imperialist framework. Even though the individuals who hold social democratic tendencies tend to be anti-imperialist, their ambitions have always been through trying to influence and de-imperialize the Democratic Party. Whereas labor, I mean, yeah, labor's labor.
To be fair, I mean, I would have sort of fit the Democrats or a wing of the Democrats in under the same sort of category. But if you're sitting outside it, then
what the anti-capital, we have a libertarian anti-capitalist, right? Like I guess the equivalent in the UK would be if the Lib Dems were remotely principled. And what was interesting in Trumpism, right, is Trumpism managed to merge in a very strange way the anti-imperial right with the imperialist right. Because like I actually had a libertarian come on my show and point that out to me, and I thought about it a little bit. I was like, this guy talks like Trump would say stuff like he didn't believe in American exceptionalism.
Yeah,
like, which is wild.
Was it phased, or was that from the very get-go?
It was from the very get-go. But he also made imperialist gestures from the very get-go too. Although what I would say is that increased as he was actually
That's
president.
what I meant by phased. Yeah,
right.
Once he got to power, it was like it was more. Let's go.
But there is a weird nascent reactionary. Not to call anti-imperialism reactionary, but there is kind of a nascent a reactionary anti-imperialism and anti-globalism. Like it is reactionary. There's no doubt about it. It's very nationalist. But it thinks the United States' role as the imperial hegemon is prompted by outsiders, probably alien Jews. But regardless, is not in the interest of the United States. That has been a bigger factor in our politics outside of, say, the anti-imperialists in the Democratic Party, which there have always been some. I mean, even historically going back to World War I and II. Although ironically, again, to point out your point about them being rightists, the anti-imperialists in World War I tended to be people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy.
Yeah,
so
I can imagine.
Didn't think Wilson was racist enough. So so that is its own madness. But we have a particular kind of reaction to imperialism here. But there is also a fundamental denial about the U.S. being at its foundation an imperial project. Like we've
freedom.
Always been expected, the Empire of Liberty, which was the way we actually used to describe it, right?
Yeah.
Like we got to kick all the Europeans out, but we're not giving that stuff back to the indigenous people. No, of course not. Like that's underdeveloped land. What are you on? But I mean, the first, and I think people in the UK and definitely people in Canada know this, but people in the United States don't. I mean, before westward expansion, what did the U.S. try? Northern expansion. We tried to absorb the rest of the British colonies and then got our ass kicked. So we started cannibalizing off of the remains of France and Spain's colonial project, and thus, acquired the rest of the United States through hook, crook, force, blood, and toil.
Yeah, I remember back 20 years ago when the whole shit was kicking off and anarchists marching in the street everywhere. General Ledley Smith, a famous quote from 100 years ago. Yeah, your turn now.
Yeah, the war is racket quote. Yeah. But that guy was a right winger.
Oh no, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is our empire. It's the Monroe Doctrine is our constitution now, and And it's our century. Oh, that shit.
Well, you know what's funny? I love that Daniel Bessner over here in the States is finally pointing this out to Americans, because Americans always been like, oh, the Monroe Doctrine's anti-imperialist. We're kicking the Europeans out. I'm like, we're kicking the Europeans out so we can be the only imperialist in town. It's not because we're nice. Like we don't want we don't want France and Mexico, so we can decide what the hell goes on in Mexico. What are you on? Like
the back to the crisis question. As far as I understood it, like whatever about sort of predictions, like, oh, here it's coming now, but the only real sort of the crisis was the Great War period and leading up to it. Would that be correct?
Well, I would say, okay, if you want to look at the major crises of capital where you have complete temporary breakdown, yes, it is the Great Depression. It is the interwar period where this really shows up. But people forget that even in the United States, there have been 4 formal depressions between like 1860, as soon as the Civil War ended, all the way through till 1910. And in Europe, this was experienced as basically the long depression from 1850 to 1890, which only the UK kind of got out of. And the only reason it kind of got out of it was its imperial holdings. Like, so the UK does not remember like basically Victorian and Edwardian times as a total shit show, but the rest of Europe really kind of does. And in the United States, it's just kind of forgotten about as this weird period between our Civil War and then, World War I happening. Like we just like nothing happened between,
Yeah. But it is so my understanding of the crisis is that this sort of interminable decay of capitalism and the concentration of power among the imperial powers decreasing continuously because it's competition, becoming so acute as to lead to something like the Great War period.
Yeah, I would agree that it's in its international context, the inability to get rid of overproduction through anything other than basically killing off hundreds of thousands of people became sort of inevitable. It wasn't, and I don't want people to think, but I say that capitalists thought we needed war. I don't think they thought that ever. Yeah. What I think was like the tensions over competition between these groups, particularly as like there's not a whole lot of the globe left that is weak enough to not resist you, that you can claim as part of your empire, it is declining. We now have the inability to grow. We haven't figured out other ways to do imperialism other than basic straight up colonial mercantile extraction. So you have war over competition between, and it's a clue that develops because in World War I over like economic competition, weird legal treaties but I think that there's something else though that we don't look at, because we think about the aristocrats getting their head chopped off in France, but the feudal aristocracy was not liquidated even in France by the revolution. Its final liquidation was in World War I and II. So what I think is interesting about this is it takes the crisis, the first major world historical crisis of capitalism, which manifests in wars, to actually get rid of most of the feudal apparatus of the private
that phase is centuries.
Right. So then what does that tell us about now? I mean, because I am looking at this and going, okay, in terms of world hegemon status, the United States has kind of been a world historic fuck up, in the sense that it's not lasted very long. I mean, it's 3 generations. The norm in the United States for political norms starts with the greatest generation. It ends in the baby boomers, which is objectively the richest generation the world had ever seen on Earth. As a generation, I mean, there were still class divisions within it, obviously. And then you see the decline almost immediately within the baby boomers' own youth. geopolitical decline. Well, as soon as the United States consolidates all power against against the USSR. The USSR collapses. China seems to be on the US's side in a lot of ways, actually. It has favored nation status, even. And you see that devolve within 20 years. Like, so you're only talking about like from when I was in high school to now. That's kind of a world historically fast like degeneration, actually. Like when you like, I guess the USSR actually dissolved faster, but it's still it's kind of amazing to ponder. What is clear to me, as I was saying earlier, there is no clear imperialist power or counterpower to truly absorb the role that the US played in the way that the US was able to absorb the role that the UK played.
Right. Yeah.
There's and that is an accident of the Great Wars, and of the US's particular luck, frankly, in just not losing that much of its own productive capacity during World War II. We never geographically, we were just not touched.
Yeah, exactly.
So we didn't have to rebuild our own capacity. We still had it all. That is kind of a like in the annals of history of empire and the empire developing to replace it. I'm sure someone might find something in the deep past, but that is such a rare and weird condition. Like it doesn't happen much in the history of empire. So we're not in a situation where there's some kind of a bunch of random factors lead to this happening. I mean, I used to chastise Lenin, for example, in late imperialism. I mean, in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, the latest stage of capitalism, because he didn't see the U.S. coming. But now I kind of think, well, how would he really, like, for Russia? Like, because capital was so ensconced in Europe, and the settler colonies just didn't seem to be, from the European perspective, that big of a role. Like, it actually seemed like the semi-periphery country of Germany.
His own chauvinism
right
shone through.
Well, it's not just, I mean, it's chauvinism, but it's also well, I mean, of course it is. I actually want to just, when I say that, like, we're all kind of chauvinist in our own way. Like, it's ethnocentrism is sort of like an anthropological norm. I know people don't like it when I say that. It's not to say that it's a good. I don't think it's good. I think we have to fight it tooth and nail. But, like, if I was looking at capital from the standpoint of Europe in 1900, from a truly periphery place in Europe, because, like, the bourgeois revolution in Germany had barely happened. It didn't, and also didn't really look like a revolution. It looked like a nation building project out of the Prussia. And then the bourgeois revolution in Russia, well, you kind of didn't have one. I mean, it was kind of consolidated into the socialist revolution at the same time. So like, what, from that standpoint, and from all the things you're seeing and where your capital flows are dealing with, like, the United States just seems like this weird British colonial outpost, like Australia or something, that should not ultimately matter.
Yeah.
And what people had not been looking at is how much from that internal consolidation of the landmass of the Americas have been kind of gobbled up by the United States, and what that really gave them in terms of raw material, even if they didn't have it in terms of population.
Yeah.
Like,
but there's the private interests generating things 100 years ago as well, and they still exist. There might not be that sort of I mean, that is an interesting relationship between how the private interests. I mean, obviously states are always representing the interests of the private and the powerful, but does it matter? I mean, I guess the question sort of is negated by the very first point that was brought up, the the atomic peace. But does it matter if that wasn't? I mean, I suppose if the atomic peace never existed, we'd have an entirely different situation at the moment. But if somehow, okay, hypothetically, that was transcended, would it matter that the private interests that are intensifying power didn't have a sort of a ready-made state level vehicle to sort of push their interests on the global stage?
What I think you would see is even more what you'd see during the 20th century, which, I mean, the United States, let's not forget, the 60s was a major era of like political assassinations that we all forget happened. But like, if even with that, let's say, even though that happened, the strife you would have seen within the U.S. without the nuclear peace probably would have led to the U.S.'s disintegration from its own internal contradictions. We are highly regional people, like everybody, honestly. Like, but I was thinking about this the other day because I was thinking about, oh, well, all these new European states that Americans think like Italy and Germany are like forever old. I'm like, they were formed in the 19th century, man. Like they're actually younger countries than we are. But also like you every now and then you see these tensions in places like Italy, Germany, the UK, start to pull them apart. Well, we have that here, both in the fact that we have our own racial problems, in quotation marks, that have become undeniable, and within the United States itself, even within the most conservative parts of the United States, the fact that they don't want to talk about it anymore is actually them acknowledging the problem, and just hoping that as you plug your ears and close your eyes, it'll go away. But also that there's regional tensions and regional economic tensions within the United States, because there is a real sense, for example, that like core periphery relations between the United States also happen within the United States itself, and it's kind of obscured by the United States focus on tax flows. So everybody looks at the focus on tax flows, particularly in the American liberal left, as saying, oh, well, the red states are moochers and the blue states are the givers, because the blue states pay more in federal taxes than they get back, and the red states, okay, that's actually true. But if you actually look at like where wealth is going, wealth is being sucked out of the Midwest. It was already sucked out of the South into the coastal poles. Very similar to the resentment you see in the UK, I think, with the way everybody kind of hates London because it sucked all the money out of everywhere else. Like, so that internal dynamic would be a lot more fractured if we didn't have the Red Scare unifying us, and nuclear arms unifying us. So in a way, I think we would have seen a bloodier but much less low stake. I mean, a bloodier but lower stakes 20th century, because the kind of thing that Lenin's describing would have not just happened, between capitalist powers. It would have happened within regions of capitalist countries. Whereas in some ways, the bomb, even though we forget it exists, is one of the stabilizers of the internal politics of these places as well. And that's not something Marxists have really looked at. Again, Christopher Lasch kind of turned me onto it, because he wrote an article defending the concept of revolution, but saying both that the 19th century or 20th century idea of insurrections in the cores of capital were nonsense after the development of the modern nation state, particularly in its killing capacity. And that the attempts to make revolution metaphorical, like in the 60s with the New Left, et cetera, makes it just a marketing term and meaningless. Yeah. So we have to rethink what it means, but we also have to acknowledge that nobody saw that the state sector will become so important to capital in the middle of the 20th century. And that's why, for example, in the United States right now, this is why I say that like neoliberalism as we knew it is dying, is because it's clearly being abandoned by the corporations themselves.
Mm-hmm.
It is become more and more clear that the corporations are kind of split between Republican and Democrat still, but that the more profitable corporations, even though they're not profitable by commodities, they're profitable by rent, are clearly aligned to the Democrats, and the less profitable sectors of the economy have a slight and only slight bias towards the Republicans until you get down to like individual petty proprietors.
Huh.
So, and then like allegiance to the Republican jumps up massively.
I guess that's what I was getting at. It's like with the sort of situation that Lenin was describing in terms of financialization, in terms of rentierism, in terms of the actual power that specific corporations are winning, they're expanding, yet the pie isn't expanding. What happens here on now for people?
Well, I mean, the one thing you can say is whether or not what the DSA calls socialism is anything I would call socialism, you have finally seen the effects of the 50s and 60s Red Scare end to the point that
these people are toying with the concept.
Even if it's just progressivism and pink clothing, it's still different that they're doing it. The other thing that you have seen is certain factions of conservatives are now scared of socialists and communists in a way where they're not just calling every Democrat socialist and communist, which they've done forever, but that they're actually trying to resurrect things like state loyalty codes for teachers and stuff like that, which are artifacts of like the 40s.
Wow. Did you see in schools here that they banned any book? This is during the year. Any anti-capitalist teaching is banned.
Yeah, I did see that. Yeah, it's so it tells you if they have to ban it, it means it has purchase, right? Like, so, but again, in the UK, the irony of this is like, in the immediate future, you guys are basically a single party Tory state because the Labour is just gone. It's just gone. It's dissolved.
Well, they've filled that vacuum that Johnson left behind. It's like they are the Tories in the traditional sense now.
Yes,
but in terms of electability, probably not whatsoever have a chance.
Yeah, I mean, and that's wild. What's interesting is I can see that happening in the States as well, despite the fact that more people in the United States are Democrats than Republicans, and despite the fact that radical ideas are more popular now than they've ever been, there has actually been the inability for either the socialist left or the Democrats to deal with the material conditions conflicting with our federalism, and thus like increasingly depopulated areas being having more and more political sway just by accident. No one designed it that way, although it's being maintained by design. So for example, Biden is very, very unpopular. We don't know if he'll still be unpopular in 2 years, but a lot of states, despite the fact demographically the Democrats have assumed that the racial demographics would cut it in their direction, you've seen consolidations of GOP power that are thorough in the last year at the state level. And so it looks like we might be in for here a kind of period of minority rule that has happened because of ignoring the material conditions of the United States itself. Because it's not about like how many people find this popular. It's about like the way economics have encouraged centralization of population in a few key cities, but that really cuts against our federal system and actually empowers rural areas more just by dint of people leaving. And so I think the politics here are going to become more and more incoherent. Also, like, we don't have the profits that we used to have. There's just they're not there. Whether or not that's anything terminal is anyone's guess. I mean, the one thing I would say is expecting a World War II reset of profitability from the Marxist standpoint is not going to happen because it really would end the world.
Yeah.
Like, so
But something's got to give, though. I mean,
something does
globally.
have to give. It does.
And that's without thinking about the environment.
Right. That's not even looking at, I mean, one thing I will say in terms of like, if we accept the polities we have right now are going to exist in the 20th century, for example, de-escalation of the tensions between China and the United States are absolutely crucial for human survival because both sides have to do a shit ton to mitigate climate change in a way that even if Europe did everything it was supposed to do, would not matter without the U.S. and China, not just both doing it, but doing it in a coordinated and collaborative way. So like, so yeah, I mean, in the short, I mean, the question is the climate collapse going to like basically? I mean, this is the unstated but quasi-stated premise of like the communization theorist in EndNotes, right? That like the climate collapse is basically going to be the thing that gets rid of all the capital and all the people so that we could reset to something either capitalism 3.0 or 4.0 or 5.0 depending on how you're counting, or something like communism. But like my counter argument to them is just like, if that actually happens and the way it actually happens given people's propensity to panic, do you think the human race survives it? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Like annihilation is actually a possibility. So like nobody achieved power because we're all dead.
We just lost our head.
Yeah.
On our gravestone, they lost their head.
Yeah, you know. So I mean, it is a possibility, and particularly when you see like, for example, and I'm gonna use the UK again. Brexit is both an understandable condition of like the people's experience of the neoliberalism of the EU, and yet also like a total denial of the fact that because of its prior imperial status, Britain got the sweetest fucking deal ever with the EU. It got total currency sovereignty and a way to suppress its native labor force earning capacity by driving down wages with Eastern European labor who could come in and seemingly benefit from the exchange rate because of, and now Brexit ended that sweet deal.
His pockets.
So like now you're gonna be like, well, now we actually have to pay local wages for shit. Oh shit! Like no one wants to do work.
No one was talking about again the material conditions of anything leading up to that. It's just not interesting,
right? And it's not interesting, and also like when you think about it, there's no way to spin. Like I get why, for example, Corbyn was in this weird mealy mouth bullshit that he was doing about Remain or Leave that led him to like totally lose in a lot of ways.
Do you know? I thought that was just like a reaction to Stalin. Honestly, the merely 4 or 5 years ago, the sort of the idea of like strongman communism is probably that. I think that's where he was coming from with that.
He's so yeah. Well, I mean, I'm also I do find it ironic that Stalinism has been reborn now at a point where it is like the least applicable that it's ever been as far as like using it as an actual model for anything.
Yeah.
Because the only model that you really get from it is like big man good. Because like Dungism.
That's it. Corbyn just wasn't enough of a daddy.
Yeah.
That's it.
I mean, in some ways, actually, you know, there is a sense of like people wanted a Bonapartist figure, and neither Borny nor Corbyn could give it to them. And to be fair, they weren't really looking at the structures of the U.S. or UK state either. And my other critique of Corbynism was that like his economic model was kind of based off of pretending that you could just will the situation of the 70s back into Britain just cause. And it's like, that's Not gonna happen, bro.
There was an attempt at the grassroots that would be necessary, but like it's badly timed, badly managed, and wrong people in the wrong places. And
yeah, well, I mean, like, yeah, with people like, well, Corbyn has working class support. I'm like, he does in London,
yeah,
but you know, I mean, interestingly, one of the most fascinating things that I've seen in regards to labor is how Labor's voting patterns resemble the U.S. Democrats more and more and more since like the middle 1990s. So like, instead of it being clearly a working class coalition, which I mean, the Democrats have never been, they've never claimed to be, but as I think, and I think this part of de-radicalization has been lost on a lot of people. I mean, how many people in the north of the working class demographic that supports labor are not actually in a Marxist sense working class anymore because they're pensioners? They're out of the labor market.
Yeah.
And so the entire coalition, like the entire makeup is weird. And, you know, and no, the UK is not as federated as the US is, but like it's still kind of federated. You can still have like rotten boroughs
regional
and shit.
bits,
Yeah.
absolutely, yeah.
So it's so when you look at that, you have a similar problem to the US because it's been a developmental pattern of the coalers of capital for things to centralize more and more and more and more, where like the population centers that maybe are slightly less sympathetic, although I do think the left tends to overstate how much people understand what it's even offering. That doesn't matter because it's centralized in one part of the polity, like in only one point. And so that doesn't even transfer out to other working class people in other areas. And I think in the US this is becoming really, really acute. So like I could see, for example, I'm not going to predict the 2024 election because like apparently 70% of the population doesn't want either likely candidate, which is Trump or Biden. And we are now in a situation where in the United States, like the party's preferred candidates are always disliked by the general population, like regardless. But so that makes it kind of a wild card on what the hell is going to happen in any given year. And also they could both die of natural causes pretty easily between now and then. Frankly, they're both over 76. So I think Biden's 78 and Trump was what, 77 or something. Like they're both ancient. So I was laughing. I was like, you kind of know the U.S. is screwed because if you look at the Democratic Party and its age range, and you look at the 70s Brezhnev Politburo and its age range, that the Democratic Party is actually slightly older than the Brezhnev Politburo from the 70s. And I'm like, yeah, we're fucked. The situation, it does seem like in decline, and I'm trying to figure out how the UK actually plays in on this. So like, have you been secretly benefiting from cleaning the money of Europe and the US the whole time? That's what I probably think has been going on. Because it seems like the UK lost its empire and is bitter about it, but somehow managed to maintain its financial advantages.
That was it. That's literally it. That was the focus, wasn't it?
Right. And so now that that's ending, it's like, well, what do you got at all? Like, it's going to get pretty ugly on the islands there.
I'm pretty sure Johnson's vision is like Singapore. I'm pretty sure like it's an entire population of people that are just polishing boots for like 5 people in London. I think that's his vision. I don't know. It is kind of grim.
Reactionary Leninism in its true form. Man, that's awful. But it is, I mean, I also wonder, like, is the U.S. heading for something like that? Because, on one hand, our right has become really populist all of a sudden and actually willing to. I mean, right now in the United States, basically neoliberalism is everybody's bad guy. like regardless of where you are on the political spectrum,
yeah,
you just think that somebody else is the neoliberal, and the neoconservatives have either become populist or they become like Fukuyama,
Yeah, I didn't
like
even think that
sockdims. Like
there was anyone fronting on that.
no, they're not. It's kind of a dead project, but it wasn't really a dead project till Trump. What's interesting is Bernie did not kill the Democratic Center. In fact, he seems to actually have saved it.
Yeah.
In a way that there's the anti-left and post-left Marxists who say that was deliberate. I don't think that at all. I think it's an accident of history, but it's interesting because right now in the US you have all these socialists with nothing to do, and all they can, like, for example, to talk about the ambiguities of anti-imperialism. Anti-imperialism can be a meaningful project in the imperial core if and only if you're engaging in something like revolutionary defeatism in a war. Well, we're not in a war, right? Well, I mean, the U.S. is always in a war, but it's not in a war right now. And it's not in a war with power to which it would be even possible to truly lose. It's just possible
Defeated,
to not
exactly.
win.
Yeah, not that sort of war.
So revolutionary defeatism doesn't come into play. So then, well, what is anti-imperialism then? Well, maybe it's advocating for policies that's better for the Latin American left, but that would require electoral strategy, which a lot of people who are anti-imperialists are giving up on. So in a material sense, it's both good that people are looking at this in a world strategic way and getting out of the kind of left soft nationalism or like I called it methodological nationalism for years of the last 10 years, but it's bad in the sense that, like, yeah, but it's just a moral position. Like they're not in the position to do anything about anything. Like where you side on imperialist wars if your vote doesn't matter for those wars, and also there's no way for your side to truly lose because it's not engaging in a war where it can be defeated. All it could do is be chased out. Then anti-imperialism is a moral stance. It's not a substantively political one. And because of the reasons why we're talking about it, you can kind of pick the kind of anti-imperialism you want, because you want it to be like anti-imperialism is Big Daddy G's going to save us all, or is anti-imperialism curtailing American influence, or is anti-imperialism like Big Daddy Putin's going to save us all, which admittedly is not very popular in the U.S. left. There are a few people, but there was a time actually, but in like the early aught teens, where there were more people who thought that. I remember someone from Black Agenda Report going on and talking about how Putin was a principled anti-imperialist and just laughing.
Yeah,
but
I mean, like, Russia and China do love to toe that line.
Yeah, but and to be
you
fair,
can see why someone would have thought it.
Yeah, and to be fair to Russia, what I will say in contradiction to the American narrative is, from the standpoint of stabilizing regional influence, which is not imperial, it's just not world imperial. Russia's actions are bellicose, but they actually are pretty fucking logical. Particularly in an economy that its strong suit is basically only its military. So, and its gas, and its natural resource extraction. That's really all Russia's got. So it's it makes sense, but it's just kind of silly to put that in a moral framework. Is
there? Do you think there's any scope for sort of outlining? Because I think this topic is highly understood in terms of whether you want to call it Lenin or Trotskyist from the position or from the perspective as it was developing 100 years ago or over 100 years ago.
Right.
Is there? Because I think it's quite profound. I think it's a profound difference. Like I remember those sort of protests, the starting with Afghanistan but also linked with Seattle and all that stuff from 20 years ago, and we weren't allowed read Marx, let alone even know that Lenin had anything written. And there's ongoing fucking debates about like, is this imperialism or not? Is this American imperialism or not? And you're reading Noam Chomsky and Naomi Klein, and that's as far as it goes. Like, and it just, reading Lenin on imperialism is just like if that perspective existed, like it's profound. If that perspective existed widely 20 years ago, I think we might be in a different position, or I hope.
I would have. I think maybe you're like if the alter globalization movement had read more Lenin and less Naomi Klein. Not. Have you ever heard me tell you the story? As a side note, this is funny. But you ever told me to tell you how like my solidification as a hard Marxist, not as a Marxist Leninist or anything like that, but a truly hard Marxist was actually Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, because I took the opposite lesson that she did from it. I read it and I was like, soft socialist lose and neoliberalize.
Brilliant.
Therefore, returning to Keynesianism, which is what she tries to pivot at the end of the book, is stupid. Period. Yeah. That was like, this is like, that was my and what was interesting is you're right. Like I knew, I'd read some Lenin because I was reading the stuff on my own, but like nobody was talking about that back then. In 2007, 2008, and also if they did, I mean, honestly, like the people who were talking about it were they would put you off so much. They were like, the early PSL, and like the Spartacus League in the United States. And so you'd read,
plenty of trots still around.
Right. You'd be like critical support for Al Qaeda. And you're just like, what? Like, so I mean, literally, actually, I think about it. That period and talking to people who should have had the answer actually made the right anti-imperialist kind of paleo-conservative narrative more appealing to me in my early 20s, because even though they basically are like they actually come to some similar conclusions to Lenin in a weird way, except they have this national myth they're pushing. Because that was the only thing available to me. And the way Leninism was being presented to the general public was so ludicrous by like clearly highly sectarian, hyper dogmatic college students, basically. And then like people who were college students who were led by people who like had cut their teeth in politics in like 1965.
Yeah.
Like that's who it was back then. And so it really wasn't available. Whereas if someone had looked at this, even if they disagreed with it, but used its form of analysis and tying it all together in a more realistic way, we would have had a better answer for what to do. But you're right. We were all just debate. Like it was hard to convince Americans 20 years ago that the U.S. was an empire. Like, and I think now even the right accepts that. So
getting there. I raised the question because what I suppose why it's profound is because there's an exciting element to it, because you're not being anti-imperialist is literally a moral stance, because in imperialism you have the material development of the socialization of production, which is fucking exciting, and without looking at the super exploitation or the exploitation and the destruction of the competition, the rational abstract sort of progress is socialized production, but then socialized ownership. And if no one ever needs to raise the sort of the roots. You can put it in footnotes and stuff, but like in describing this reality that's happening outside our consciousness, with regards to these things, framing it in that sort of like list, like this, if we owned Amazon, it would be grand, like it's reframing things in that sort of profound sort of, there is something happening. We don't live in stasis. One of the biggest things about neoliberalism that period was that this sense of stasis. And we're failing to realize actually over those decades the things that are happening materially, the developments. And I just think people sort of poo-poo on sort of on oh, if you just tell people, then everyone will sort of do something. But I think that I don't know. It seems like there's untapped sort of scope in sort of in this analysis and in reframing things through this analysis and bringing it back to a matter of realizing the means of production. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think I am torn when I talk about this stuff, because on one hand, I think without the analytical tools, you are reinventing the real every single time. And like, yeah, some people would have come up to eventually, if they'd thrown dirt, spaghetti against the wall, somebody would have come up with a theory similar to Lenin's again. However, there's no need to do that when there's already a pretty functional theory. It's just under the scary L guy's name. And I see this as a person who I do think there are other elements of Leninism that people fetishize that just aren't actually that useful anymore, because we're in a completely different context.
Yeah.
But this one is one that at least its impulse to look at, like, how does national polity and nation, relate to the capitalist impulse? Because clearly it does, and there's clearly a way in which socialists failing to understand that had led them to make profound tactical mistakes. That imperialism narrative really gives you, in a way, even though it also has its own, like I said, problems, ambiguities, and things that aren't totally worked out. And I guess what I would say, yes, but also people would have needed to pick it up and continue it, not just take it as doctrine and recite it. Because what I saw, when Maoists started like showing up in the United States, they were not the kind of Maoists we had now. They were anti-China, actually, mostly. But because there's this interest in the 70s New Left again, and so like these old Cultural Revolution style, like Limbaoist, Third Worldist Maoist, kind of were a thing. And they had they had positions based on imperialism, some off Lenin, some off Mao, but they would just recite them to you and then like not really apply them in any new ways, as if as if history had fallen down in like 1975, basically. And that's also a problem. Like, if we're going to do this anti-imperial critique, because I think what I will say on this, I think Lenin, as I said way back in the beginnings, genius in this is that he saw two theoretical economic problems in Marxism that both seem to have empirical evidence. Periodic declining rates of profits causing basically what we would call a business cycle, and what Marxists traditionally call crisis. And then also, and concurrently, monopolizations increasing in the state, thus the need to grow new markets and correct profits at a kind of different cheatery way from classical Marxism. And these trends are both in Marx and Engels, but they're not put together in that way. I mean, like, if you think about what Lenin and Bukharin would probably point out to you is like, look, like the monopoly capital thesis coming out of finance capital from Hilferding leads them to develop capital. And the Social Democrats become the handmaidens of capital in Germany, which is bizarre, but makes some sense. But that tendency is real. Now let's assume it's real. Let's look at inter-imperialist competition and why, and look at this other trait that would explain why that what Hilferding was trying to do with the Social Democrats in Germany is doomed, and why we're on the precipice of more world wars. Like, I think, and why Kautsky's sitting on his hands, and the SPD vote was so disastrous. even if he didn't actually vote for the war bonds, which, you know, often both Marxist-Leninists and Trotskyists will say, because they don't really know the history well enough. But so that's interesting. Implicit being that imperialism is already implicit in Marxism. Lenin is making it explicit. Now, what else you do with that is different. Like, I actually think there's other questions involved. Like, the national question is not implicit in Marxism. Like you cannot find a Marx text to answer one way or another the contradictions that seem to come out of the national question. But you can definitely find a Marx text that you can find plenty of them that explain why imperialism would have been a natural conclusion of a sclerotic national capitalism, that there was no real other thing for it to do and survive. And I think that would have been very useful to have 20 fucking years ago.
Yeah.
It would have been very useful to have even it was useful in the 60s and 70s, actually. I mean, we forget that in America, it was this notion that actually, again, revitalized liberalism. But still, like, the liberal social movements were actually acutely aware of this kind of stuff because of their relationships with a group like the Black Panthers. Mm-hmm. They were watering it down, but they knew it. And by the 90s, it had seemingly just been lost. And so, yeah, I think you're right about that. This is a very long-winded way of me.
Is there a threshold, do you think? And I think this was the sort of the crude thinking we were at like 2 years ago. But is there a threshold where profits, and I don't mean you know, traditional capitalist profits like exploitation of labor, but even from rents, where they just don't matter anymore? Where they decrease in importance, where the game changes.
Yes, but what that has meant is capitalism has died without socialism taking place. That's what it means. I mean, like, and who knows what? I don't know what that is. Like, I do fundamentally think it is a real possibility, because I think about like how like minoralism and feudalism emerged out of antique society is basically from like there being nothing like a revolution, a civil revolution in the Roman Empire, and everything going sclerotic. And it wasn't even a decline. It was just a fundamental change of form that no one even saw or meant. That could happen. I mean, that is a historical possibility. I think Marxists have assumed that communism was inevitable for far too long. I would love for it to be inevitable, but I don't think there's any empirical evidence for that at this point. Capitalism may end in some horrid new semi-feudal, like, even calling it feudalism is wrong, but that's the closest thing I could think about what it would be. Like,
that was the thing I'd come across. So I was just like in the chat in that podcast. It's just like, are we talking about neo-feudalism here? And I actually, there was like 20 minutes in one of the podcasts and 20 minutes in the other. I spliced them together and made them a video and just called it neo-feudalism. And it was for a very long time, until I took it down, it was the most popular video that we had. And it's just this sort of concept of neo-feudalism seems to be touching a nerve with a lot of people.
I think because conceptually, if we move to a purely rentier economy, that's the only prior historical thing that seems to. So, I mean, I guess maybe a slave economy. But even then, like, calling it neo-feudalism is both fair and a little misleading, because it's not going to be true feudalism. We're not going to have lords in that way, and it's also hard to imagine what the rentier economy sustain themselves off of if they have to grow. But I suppose that they don't have to grow. Like, that's what, like, but if that happens, you are not dealing capitalism anymore. And I think that's something. I think that's something what I would say is that's something we have to ponder. Is what are the post-capitalist futures where we lose?
Yeah. That's sort of what I was getting at. I mean, I do think like sort of because that was, like I said, it's pretty crude thinking. We were playing with the logics of Harvey and Wood, and came up with it. So it's like in reading Lenin, there is a compelling alternative narrative, and I think that it's the compelling nature of like, oh yeah, okay, so we thought this, but it seems a little bit ridiculous now. Not necessarily impossible, but I don't know. Yeah, there just seems to be a lot untapped in that analysis, and I think that was my interest in it. And when like talking to you very initially, it's still on the list, but like reading Kotsky's Ultra Imperialism is still how much does it impede that possibility?
I don't know. I mean, well, part of my thinking is if the ultra imperialist thesis is true in the long term, then again, the strange implication is that eventually capitalism actually isn't capitalism anymore, because like I don't know how you don't have competition and the expansion of markets and this, that, and the other. And I mean this, and this isn't just me talking as a doctrinaire Marxist. This is me talking as someone who like looks at energy flows and systems physics, right? Like a closed system like that would be highly anthropic. Like it just would be. This is why autarkies, like national autarkies, get into such shit. Like no matter how awesome they are, you have entropy within the system at a certain point. And so like I think in regards to this, it's just impossible to know what this would look like, except it kind of, I don't know, it's like a grim like Blade Runner future, where like corporations kind of really are our overlords in a literal sense, and like and everything's a company town, because like there's really not any, like everything's based off RIT exchanges for meager amounts of labor that they barely need you to do
exactly.
like it's like but there's no, you got to have people somewhere in the system like fix the fucking machines. So like I don't know, I mean, to me that's like the worst Nick Landian future that you could have. But I do think it's a real possibility, like
compelling narrative to try to stop it, huh?
Yeah, I mean, like like your options are either that or like hope that China becomes communist in the classical sense of the term. Those are your options right now as things are, without us doing anything else. And I think you see that weirdness in people's politics even right now, because they're that whole neo-reaction thing, like in accelerationism, does seem like it's like, well, we can't change it, so we might as well join it. So yeah. I always like to end on gloomy notes, but that would be the.
I'd hoped to be able to drive it that way for the conclusion. I'm very satisfied.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you, Ed.
Thanks
we'll
for having
do
me.
This again. Well, you kind of more have me than the other way around this time.
Like, no. I came here. I came here to the church to learn. There. Those questions were.
I will. I appreciate it, and we'll have more across the frigid pond exchanges in the future. And yeah, we'll end here.